One of the things that's really important to know about the way that the philosophy of happiness has turned out in recent years is that it's an area of study that sort of combines the different ways in which we look at philosophy as well as psychology, as well as the areas of science that people study in terms of neurology and the way in which the mind works. So there's a number of different debatable points that I think we can talk about today that might be interesting for us to think about. So let me go ahead and share with you what I have for my outline for the presentation. The first thing I think it would be good for me to share with you are some of the different questions and problems about defining and measuring happiness, especially in terms of the ways in which people in neuroscience have tried to study it, and the ways in which people in sociology have tried to quantify happiness, ways in which people have tried to compare happiness around the world in different nations. And then there's different philosophers who have theories of happiness. Some of these ideas about happiness may or may not be helpful for us. And the way that my colleague Gary Santos started to teach about this used films in the context of class material that students might find entertaining. So I wanted to bring in a number of different examples, both films that he had used in class and ones that might be, since he taught the class, things that we've used to update the class since he stopped teaching it after he retired. And so these five different theories of happiness will come up for you at different points during the presentation tonight. The idea that happiness involves using reason and the rationality of the human mind is one of the theories of philosophers that will be interesting for us to consider. Another aspect of the philosophy of happiness that we might be able to use tonight is the idea of friendship and social connections and the society that we live within. That living a happy life requires that we take part in society, and sometimes that we are also very much engaged in the civic and political world around us. For some people, that idea of being happy in terms of being engaged with those around us and taking a part in a group, that's important for being happy. The third possibility for a philosophy of happiness, knowing yourself, having an important aspect of self-knowledge, knowing what you really want to do in your life, being self-determined, and being able to make choices that are what you genuinely want to do. Even if it might go against social norms, even if it might be something that is not necessarily the popular thing to do. And then the fourth possibility, the idea that happiness comes from struggling and meeting challenges, being able to overcome something, being able to meet a challenge, being able to strive for something and successfully achieve it. Some people might say that they would not be happy if they had not had to work hard for something. That's one of the theories that philosophers will also mention when it comes to the theories of happiness. There's other philosophies of happiness and religious ideas about happiness that involve the idea that happiness involves not struggling, being able to accept things as they are, and being able to minimize our suffering, being able to be happy and content with what we already have. So between these five different theories of happiness, we're going to see tonight what we think would be the best or most useful definition of happiness. So let me go ahead and share with you first some of the research that has been done in terms of trying to quantify or define happiness using social science, using sociology, using surveys. This is research from 2022, looking at scores regarding wealth and happiness in different nations around the world. And I can definitely enlarge this for us to be able to see different parts of the graph in more detail if it's a little hard to see on your screen right now. The interesting thing for us to look at is that many people in the world might imagine that they could be happy if they were just more wealthy, that people would be happy if they just had more money. And if you look at the way that this particular chart shows up, it definitely gives one the impression that there is at least a statistical correlation between wealth and happiness. The way that the chart moves up in a diagonal line, that's what that usually signifies, is that there is a statistical correlation. And if you look at the different nations that have high wealth, they're very wealthy and they're very happy. You can imagine that people in these nations very often are cited as having this sort of positive life expectancy. And then there's other nations that might be seen as struggling in certain ways, whether it's because of economic problems or difficulties with politics or challenges that have happened in those nations, whether it's, problems of education, problems of issues with race, problems of military interventions that have happened in those nations. To look at this even a little bit more clearly, in 2023, there were also researchers who decided to go ahead and isolate certain specific nations as the ones that were the most important to focus on within this particular graph image. And if you look at what you see here, one of the nations that is always highlighted as having the highest gross gross income, the highest wealth, and the highest happiness score is Luxembourg. That's this nation that you see here. And then if you imagine that Luxembourg is upheld as this example of very peaceful, very wealthy, very happy nation. And then down at the other side, we see the example of Afghanistan. There's a question here about there's been lots of different military issues that have happened in Afghanistan, war, many different people who have suffered many different economic problems, health problems, education. There's a low life expectancy. There's all sorts of issues that have been faced there. The United States likes to see itself as being a very successful, very prosperous, very happy country. Finland very often is seen as an example of a democracy where people might not have as much money because there's high taxes, but there is a relatively even amount of economic security, one might say. And then the interesting example here is Hong Kong. People imagine that Asian nations are somehow on the rise economically, but yet at the same time, Hong Kong tends to score relatively low compared to countries like Luxembourg and the United States in terms of happiness. So if we were trying to define what makes people happy using scales involving wealth, there's certain limitations that we might want to consider. It's not like there's a direct relationship between wealth and happiness. There might be a statistical correlation, but there's certainly something more complex, something more rich that we would need to be able to define to be able to use these kinds of scales. Now, another thing that might be interesting for us to consider is the question of whether wealth is reflected in people being able to meet their basic needs. In sociology, Maslow's research on the hierarchy of needs comes to mind at this point. In Maslow, if people are able to meet their basic needs of survival, then they can work their way up this pyramid. They're able, once they have basic survival needs met, to work on safety, to then find love and belonging, to then be able to work towards self-esteem and self-actualization. Once a specific normal standard of living is met, the theory goes, there's actually a way in which having additional wealth and higher status can create deeper and more serious problems for those individuals. So supposedly there's actually a situation that creates diminishing returns. Once someone is actually even more wealthy beyond a certain level, then they end up feeling pressure to maintain that wealth. They end up feeling like they have to keep up a certain standard of living. They have to keep up appearances. There may be certain negatives associated with being especially wealthy. So in many nations, they actually associate this with an amount of wealth that's around the six-figure mark, 100,000 US dollars. And if you end up having much more wealth above that, then they find that there is actually an increasing amount of anger, stress, feeling not happy. So if we were trying to quantify what happiness is, if we were trying to find something that we could directly measure as having a direct relationship to happiness, usually it's not wealth. And of course, the Maslow hierarchy of needs has undergone a number of different updates, especially in the context of the internet. And you can see that this is a particularly funny, cheeky one where people added on Wi-Fi at the very bottom of the Maslow hierarchy of needs. The idea that people need to be able to access the internet and have computer technology and have internet access and have access to the different kinds of social media that they like to be able to check every day, that for a lot of people creates happiness. This in itself brings up a lot of important questions. Because if you imagine that there are people who get addicted to the internet, it brings up a lot of questions about whether happiness is something that you can actually always feel, if you can always be in the state of happiness, or if there is a problem with someone who tries to always be happy. People who have addictions to the internet or addictions to substances, there is a problem that is referred to as a dopamine reward system problem that they might be experiencing. So, if we're going to study happiness carefully, we have to be aware of some of the different problems that could result from this issue of dopamine. So, let's take a look a little bit at what we are referring to here. When someone is engaged in an activity that they enjoy and they feel rewarded by, especially a quick reward, like going to their favorite internet search engine and going to their favorite TikTok, going to their favorite Instagram, and seeing things and having likes and being able to click like and being able to get likes and being able to get followers and being able to have friends that they see online and having these parasocial relationships that are not real social relationships, it creates a kind of unhealthy dopamine reward cycle. And it can cause a non-helpful change in their emotional reaction to successes. So, one of the ways that people understand this is by referring to something called the hedonic treadmill. We end up on a treadmill trying to enjoy ourselves and trying to have happiness that repeats over time. Eventually, if this happiness keeps repeating, it ends up being something that we don't really even feel in the same way anymore. We kind of develop a certain amount of numbness to it. There's even research that shows that a lot of our happiness might be related to genetic predispositions that we have inherited from generations before us. This is an example of a chart showing the hedonic treadmill effect. There's a theory that says that even when someone experiences something that might be considered a major adverse event in their life, they tend to return to eventually, over a certain number of years, the same basic level of happiness that they may have experienced before that dramatically negative life event. So, if we were to imagine that happiness or one's basic emotional state could actually be predetermined to some extent by genetic predisposition or nature nurture, there's a lot of psychology behind how someone is going to react to situations that they experience in life. For philosophers, we have to bear all of that in mind. And when we think about this idea of how people pursue happiness, there's a lot of discussions about this that come out of utilitarian philosophy. For example, John Stuart Mill and the ideas of people like Jeremy Bentham, who discussed the hedonic calculus. If people try and make themselves happy, if people are trying to pursue the greatest good in life, if people are always trying to get good rewards, then that can end up actually having a negative effect in the long run. And perhaps sadly, for anyone who might be an animal rights advocate, this is something that's found in many different mammal species. As far back as 1954, James Olds and Peter Milner were doing neuroscience experiments about reward centers in rats and mice. And it turns out that if you are able to create an experiment in which rats are given the chance to stimulate the pleasure centers of their brain, then they will choose to constantly reward that pleasure center of their brain again and again and again at an astonishingly high rate, 2,000 to 7,000 times per hour. And they will give up everything else in life. They will give up food, water, mating. They will give up a lot of other things because they are enjoying that feeling. that ends up turning into a situation where they just want to keep doing that and they actually really are not liking it or enjoying it. They're really not happy anymore. They have become dependent on being able to keep doing that activity that they enjoy. If we keep that in mind going ahead from 1954 to the present day, the way that people who are addicted to something like the internet actually follows that same kind of negative reward loop. If you imagine the way that people who are, going online and they have to be connected to their phone, they have to have their phone with them all the time. It's a very similar kind of reward loop system where they feel like they have to have that. It's a form of distracting yourself from things going on in the real world around you. You feel a motivation to pick up the phone again because you need to feel that dopamine increase again. And then eventually the dopamine will end up falling. Your body is not able to get back that feeling of good dopamine again, and you become numb to that dopamine feeling. And then you end up repeating that same negative activity, which just makes your relationship to the dopamine get worse and worse and worse over time. So the science behind happiness is really important for us to consider. One of the reasons why I think that philosophers have so many different theories about happiness is that one of the healthiest ways to try and be happy is to have many different ways to be happy. You can't just repeat the same unhealthy way of being happy because that creates a negative bad habit. So, if we were going to try and understand all of the science and all the quantity, all the quantification ideas about what happiness is, all these studies that have been done by the scientists, then what we need to do is think about, okay, if we understand that neurological research and looking at dopamine's effect on the brain means that we can't always be happy. We need to have different ways of understanding what happiness is, and we might need a variety of ways to understand what happiness is. Then we're going to be thinking about, okay, should happiness just be a result of what we have, like things, wealth, or should it also be about activities? Should it be about things that we do with ourselves, with our life? Should we then also think about happiness as appreciating what we have, or should it be about the things that we had to do to achieve something? Should it be about achievement? Should it be about struggle? Should it be about how we educate ourselves to live a good life? And then, does meeting challenges make life more worthwhile? And then we can think about how different philosophers can help us to understand these questions. And that's where the philosophy of happiness comes in. So, one of the first philosophers that we can talk about is Aristotle from ancient Greece, around 300 BC. Here's a little bit of the ancient Greek vocabulary that we talk about with Aristotle. Aristotle would tell us that the best kind of life is the life that embodies virtuous behavior. The ancient Greek word for this would be arete. Arete means excellence. And everything in the world essentially has an arete. It has an excellence that it is meant to try and live up to. So you could imagine that an excellent knife is a knife that cuts well. It's a sharp knife that does its job well. And a person is someone who does things excellently, who does things well. And if you are able to grow up and see examples of people who are doing things well in the world, then you can eventually live with excellence. You can have virtuous behavior, and you will have a flourishing life. Flourishing in ancient Greek would be eudaimonia. When it comes to how Aristotle would try and advise us about how to learn to do this, he would say, find examples of people who know how to behave in a lot of different situations. They have probably been taught how to moderate their behavior. Moderation for the ancient Greeks, it really is something that applies to almost any positive character trait, any positive word that you could imagine. Words like courage, words like altruism, words like charity, any of these things that we might think of as being something positive, those kinds of things have to be done in a way that's balanced. in a way where if you're going to be courageous, you have to know how courageous to be in a specific situation. If you're going to be altruistic or give charity, you need to know how much charity to give. In other words, if you're going to be courageous, are you someone who is a member of the military who must engage in hand-to-hand combat, or are you somebody who happens to be in a convenience store when it is held up and you are not expected to fight hand-to-hand combat in that situation? The situation calls for different amounts of courage. Literally, that's moderation. And then when you do charity, you want to be able to be someone who is charitable, who is giving to good causes, but you don't want to give so much that you have nothing left for yourself and you suddenly become totally broke yourself. That would be unwise. So the reason, the rationality is the most important part. Being able to follow that kind of an example. And then when Aristotle talks about the idea of being happy with your friendships, it's about trying to have friendships that are also very rational in their approach. They should involve mutual respect. Whenever a friendship is involving using other people, taking advantage of other people, that's a friendship that has gone too far. It has not been moderate. It has not been calm in the way that it should be in the reasoned sense. So you can imagine that there's going to be this need for those kinds of reasoned approaches to life, and that creates a life of flourishing, a life of happiness. That's an important insight from the ancient Greek approach to the happiness question. Now, when Dr. Ari Santos started to teach the philosophy of happiness class here at VSU, he wanted to make sure that he had films that students could watch that would illustrate these approaches. He first began the class to be an online class, and he would invite students to be able to see or rent the movie, stream the movie, and then write papers, combining the philosopher's text with key scenes from the films. And for Aristotle, two of the key example films that he would advise students to take a look at were Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and Memento. For Dr. Santos, these films really showed the idea of using reason to try and be able to be moderate in your approaches to life. In Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, we see a situation in which a couple has come to the end of a relationship and there's an emotional reaction that they're having, and people are feeling like maybe I should just delete this person from my memories. And instead, the reasoned approach and the calm approach to what it's like to end a relationship is what's more advisable. In Memento, the idea of being able to remember and use your past experiences to give you key insights into what you should be doing in the future is one of the major themes of the film. Being able to remember what you have done before, being able to learn from past mistakes is very important. Now, the next philosopher who I personally would also add into this after Dr. Santos started the class is Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi, of course, someone who was associated with the Middle Ages philosophy. He would have been born in what was Kyrgyzstan and then ended up passing away in Damascus in Syria. And in Al-Farabi's work, he points out that once someone is a human being who is learning this idea of developing the virtues, that they then must engage in civic life. They should be involved with a moral community to be able to develop happiness fully in the world around them. The idea that practical virtues are most meaningful when they are within a community and that the community is developing and the individual person is developing within the community as well. So I wanted to also think about films that might be good examples of someone developing as a part of a community, as a part of someone who's with social relationships. And if you've ever seen the film A Man Called Otto or the original European film that it was based on, A Man Called Ove, in this particular film, it starts out with a man who has suffered the loss of his spouse, and he's basically living a life in which he is not connected to anyone anymore at all. Over the course of a film, he ends up meeting his neighbors and he ends up finding out that he is very much needed by his neighbors and he reconnects with people during the course of the film. And it shows that the idea of his happiness being connected to his civic and social relationships is an important ongoing theme in the film. And then It's a Wonderful Life is a classic older film that very often gets shown around Christmas time. But one of the things that's important about that film is the idea that no one is a failure who has friends. That you might have times in life when you feel like you are going through something very difficult and very challenging, but that people do end up having these social connections which are meaningful and which are important, and that each individual person's life does make a difference to others. Now, another film that's kind of along those same lines is the Paul Newman film Nobody's Fool. In that film, Paul Newman is playing a character who has led a very difficult life, but he also has these same kinds of social connections that end up being very important within his community. And it turns out by the end of the film that he realizes he's very important to his son and to his grandson. And his social life ends up being something that makes him happy by the end of the film. Now, here's another theory about happiness out of those first five that I mentioned on our outline screen. Having free agency is very important in the work of Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre is French, and existentialist is one of the words that we usually associate with Jean-Paul Sartre. The idea of existentialism in general is the idea of being able to know yourself and choose authentically. If you are able to make authentic choices based on what you really and authentically know about yourself and what you really want to do in life, then you will end up having a happy life. Of course, the challenge is to be able to really know yourself and know authentically what you want to do. Most of the time, many of us are raised with social pressures about what the society expects us to do, what the world wants us to do, what the world thinks that we ought to do. For Sartre, he would talk about examples of people who had, grown up thinking that they had to get married. And he would end up saying, maybe you don't necessarily have to get married. If you know for certain that you will not be happy being married, then you can freely choose not to marry. Of course, then you do end up having to accept whatever the consequences will be of that choice. You may end up needing to take care of yourself as you get older. You will end up having some difficulties that you have to face because of that choice. But if that is your authentic choice, then that will be a happy life for you. Because as long as you made the choice authentically and you knew yourself that that was what you wanted, and you were honest with other people about it, you didn't try to mislead anyone, then that is a good thing. Then that ends up making you happy. People who are unhappy for Sartre are the people who have made choices in bad faith. People who have not been authentic about their choices themselves, people who have not known themselves enough to be honest with themselves about what they want out of life, or people who have been dishonest with others. That concept of existentialism is very interesting to think about when it comes to this question of what makes people happy. And I think that it's kind of an interesting idea. If we end up looking at film examples of what this might look like, these are the kinds of films where at least a couple of them Dr. Santis did use in his classes. The Jim Carrey film, The Truman Show, is a very interesting film about a man who has been raised as a reality television show without having been told he was in a reality television show. His whole life has been televised. And it's the kind of thing where suddenly he realizes as an adult, he starts to notice clues and he begins to realize, oh, wait, this is a television show. I have not been living a real life of my own. Other people have been manipulating me. These other people I'm interacting with are characters in a show. So I don't want to spoil any of the endings of these films for you just in case you haven't seen them. But it's very interesting to think about what that might mean for somebody to choose something authentically at that point. The film Pleasantville has another similar kind of a theme. In that film, two young people from modern day life end up being taken into the world of a black and white 1950s sitcom television show. And it brings up a lot of questions about whether or not they might actually be happier living in that kind of a world, if people are more honest or more sincere in that kind of a world. And then their presence in that black and white television show world ends up changing people there, people in that black and white television show world begin to realize that they have other opportunities and other choices. And then they become happy because they have made new choices. So it's kind of an existentialist sort of a theme about what goes on in that world. Now, I Heart Huckabees is a film that didn't have as much of a broad opening. It's a little bit more of an independent film, but it also has some very explicit references, but in particular to existentialism during the film. And you can imagine that in this context, it's sort of interesting. There's a number of different characters who are having these moments where they're being asked to make authentic choices or deal with the idea of whether or not their life is going to end up having meaning because of their choices or because of other people telling them something that they should do. And so that's a very existentialist theme. Now, here's another question that we should ask. So far, we've covered the idea of people using reason, people choosing authentically, people trying to lead a moderate life, people trying to lead a virtuous life, and people trying to live a civically engaged life in society. We can also think about it in terms of struggle. There's different schools of thought within philosophy about whether or not living life in a struggle, striving for something better is important for happiness, or if we should actually consciously choose not to struggle and to be content with what we have. So let's take a look at a couple of philosophers from these schools of thought and consider what we might think. Friedrich Nietzsche is, for many people, a problematic philosopher. He is German and he lived very, very soon before the Nazi Party took over in Germany. And for many people, he is associated with the Nazi Party. Unfortunately, some of that has to do with his sister having corrupted some of his writings to make them more palatable for the Nazis, but he definitely does have some ideas that are potentially problematic. But there are other people who find him to be very empowering, if you will, because he believes in the idea of not being a passive person, not being too nice, not letting others take advantage of you. One of the things he's known for is a critique of Christianity. He sees Christian values as being too passive, as being very much emphasizing the meek shall inherit the earth. Turn the other cheek when someone wrongs you. If we take that as being something that would leave us being taken advantage of, and if instead we say, well, we should assert ourselves and define ourselves and exercise our own will to power and not see ourselves as someone else's victim. And if we imagine that the world would be a good place if everyone saw themselves as empowered and able to actualize themselves, he calls that kind of a world inter pares, being able to live among equals. And then if everyone sees themselves as a overman, as an Übermensch, he seems to think that a society made up of all of us acting as fully empowered people would be somehow a good thing. So there are people who try not to include everyone as being potential overmen. If we think of everybody as being potentially able to be empowered and be an overman, what would that look like? Let's try and think about, everybody trying to overcome and be able to strive and be able to live up to a challenge. Films that we could illustrate with this point. The Pursuit of Happiness is a film that Dr. Santos would have taught in his class. In this film, you end up seeing Will Smith striving as somebody who is working independently as a medical equipment salesman. And over the course of the film, he faces a number of challenges. And I won't give away too much in case you haven't seen it, but it does have an ending that could be described as positive. The Shawshank Redemption is a film about men in prison. And there is a way in which, by the end of the film, they end up finding a way of actually overcoming their difficult backgrounds and being able to set up a new life for themselves outside of prison. The film Amélie, or in French, Le Fabuleux Destin d'Amélie Poulain, is a really interesting film that usually, people might imagine that Nietzsche is not including women as being overmen. But if you wanted to imagine that Amélie is a character who is raised in a family situation that might be described as very constrained, very repressed, but over the course of the film, she is slowly able to come out of her shell and decide a certain number of things to try and make sure that she is actually in control of her own life and learning to find happiness, learning to find love for herself, she, by the end of the film, does seem to have made progress in terms of defining herself and being able to actually overcome some of the barriers that she has been raised with, perhaps. So we might imagine that being like the example of a Nietzsche. Now, what if we try and imagine happiness being purposely not striving, not struggling, and instead trying to just minimize our suffering and trying not to pursue any kind of stress? In the context of Buddhism, Buddhism teaches that happiness is not about pursuing happiness. If happiness is not going to be about looking at others and trying to get what they have. Happiness is not going to be about attaching ourselves to some end goal or to some wealth or to some status or to something that we are looking for in the future. Instead, we have to learn to be content with what we have already. Instead of struggling, we are going to find a way to eliminate suffering by not seeking something that we don't already have. In a way, Buddhism is emphasizing that happiness comes from changing our mind, from changing the way that we look at the world outside of ourselves. So this is an interesting possibility. In some ways, I think that this Buddhist idea is, in a way, the polar opposite of what Nietzsche is talking about. It's not trying to empower yourself. And ironically, by not trying to empower yourself, you become empowered to actually be happy and to be content. So if we were to imagine these different theories of happiness, and if we were to try and figure out, okay, is there any one of them that could encapsulate happiness completely? I think that if you did only one of these, it would have that kind of negative dopamine effect. I don't think that any one of these would be the one answer. I think, if anything, happiness requires a variety of different possible ways of being approached depending on a situation. So for me, happiness would end up having to be circumstance based, and it would end up requiring a lot of different advice for a lot of different situations. So I introduced over our presentation tonight a number of different philosophers and a number of different films. I also thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of do a little bit of a pop quiz kind of a thing. I thought I would bring in some different examples and try and show you what might be kind of interesting for us to consider about the different examples and what we think of them. So here are some example films about learning not to suffer, learning not to struggle, learning not to seek more than what we have. Have you ever seen the film Groundhog Day starring Bill Murray? It was actually one of these films in which the man played by Bill Murray in the film is experiencing the same day over and over and over again. He has been sent to an actual town where the groundhog is. It was actually filmed in northern Illinois, very close to where I'm from. And in that particular story, he ends up experiencing the same day over and over again. And he realizes that that's actually giving him a chance to learn something about himself and learn something about how to live. He ends up finally getting along with people better once he stops trying so hard. Once he starts to actually get to know people and not think about himself so much and not be selfish and not try to make himself look good, that's when he gets along with people. Little Miss Sunshine is also seen as a classic example of people learning self-acceptance. Good Will Hunting is another example of people learning to accept themselves through a process. The Razor's Edge is another Bill Murray movie, and it's based on a novel by his Somerset mom. It's about a man who has gone through some difficult times through World War I and then ends up learning about Eastern religions in India and taking on some of those lessons. Now, the movie Bedazzled might not be one that everybody's all that familiar with. It was actually a rewrite of a film that was done by Dudley Moore and Peter Cook back in the 70s. And in the context of that film, the character played by Brendan Fraser is interacting with the devil played by Elizabeth Hurley. And Brendan Fraser is trying to figure out a way for a woman to fall in love with him. And he sets up all these different scenarios with the devil giving him wishes. And it was by these different scenarios, you can imagine that he's given what he wants in his wish, but it's not going to be something that ends up causing the woman who he loves to fall in love with him. And it's only through that process that he finally learns, really, it's not about me becoming happy by having her fall in love with me. It's really about learning to let go in a way. So you can imagine that these kinds of lessons about happiness are there if you look for them in those kinds of films. So here's a guessing game with some images about happiness, and we can try and see what philosopher we think that these are associated with. So feel free to unmute if you'd like to do some guessing, or I can tell you. If you want to be somebody else, change your mind. This is a lyric from a band called Sister Hazel that was very popular back in the 90s. Changing your mind if you want to be somebody else. Basically, what it is the idea that you should not want to be somebody else. You should change your mind if you're thinking that you're going to be happy or being. That would be sort of like a kind of perhaps Buddhist insight that happiness is going to come from your own attitude, from your own way of thinking, and your way of understanding yourself, and your way of not trying to chase some other outside external reward. So stop striving. Don't be striving. Don't be struggling. Don't be trying to make yourself like somebody else. How about this one? A secret to happiness is doing hard things because nothing feels better than a hard-earned win. Nothing. The pain, the struggle, the resilience, the grit. And then the reward. The thrill of knowing that you paid the cost of entry for the thing you wanted to achieve. Hard things are good for the soul. If you look at Nietzsche's idea that striving and struggling and learning to be the Overmensch, learning to be the self-determined character, that is the secret to happiness here. How about this one? Happiness is being unapologetically yourself, doing what you want to do, choosing authentically for yourself. That is very Jean-Paul Sartre. That's a different kind of a message. That's the existentialist message. When you know yourself, you are empowered. When you accept yourself, you are invincible. This is kind of an interesting one. Knowing yourself is the existentialist idea, and then being able to accept yourself, being invincible. That sounds a lot like Nietzsche. But self-acceptance also sounds a little bit like Buddhism. So there's an interesting mix here. How about this one? Happiness is a choice, not a result. Nothing will make you happy until you choose to be happy. No person will make you happy unless you decide to be happy. Your happiness will not come to you, it can only come from you. Very much like a Buddhist idea about your attitude being what makes you happy. Happiness is having a friend who you would do anything for. This is very much like the Aristotle ideas or the Alfarabi ideas about happiness coming from civic engagement, happiness coming from our social relationships. Success is getting what you want, happiness is wanting what you get. This one is kind of like it's a classic quote from Dale Carnegie and the different kinds of motivational speeches that Dale Carnegie would do. But it's funny because if you think about it, Dale Carnegie would not necessarily be associated with Buddhism, but happiness is wanting what you get. That's a very Buddhist idea. And then how about this one? Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. That's from the philosopher Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius would have had a great deal in common with the ideas of an Aristotle looking for rationality in our way of looking at happiness. But it's also very interesting to think about the way in which we think as being a kind of Buddhist concept. So here are my works cited, here are my references. Let me go ahead and stop sharing and see what you all would like to discuss.